All right. So good afternoon and good morning or good evening if you're in a different time zone. My name is Zayton Wang, and I am assistant professor at Northern Illinois University. And on behalf of the Informs Chicago chapter, I would like to welcome and thank you for attending this webinar. This is the first of the COVID-19 webinar series that we are hosting. I hope that you will enjoy this hour because today we are very fortunate and pleased to have Dr. Sanjay Mehrotra to give a talk on his latest research about supply chain decisions for resource sharing and its application on the ongoing combat against COVID-19. Before the presentation, I need to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording to you after the webinar. And please use the Q&A or the chat box to leave your questions. I will pass the questions to Dr. Mehrotra after his presentation. I'm sure that many of you have known Dr. Mehrotra very well, but please allow me another minute to introduce him. Dr. Sanjay Mehrotra is a professor of Industrial Engineering and Management Sciences Department at the McCormick School of Engineering at Northwestern University. He is the director of Center for Engineering and Health at Northwestern. Professor Mehrotra earned his PhD in operations research from Columbia University. He is widely known for his methodological contributions to research in mathematical optimization that has spanned from linear, mixed integer, stochastic, multi-objective, and risk-adjusted robust optimization. His healthcare research includes topics in predictive modeling, budgeting, hospital operations, and policy modeling using modern OR tools. He has been the chair of the Informs Optimization Society and has also served on Informs Board of Directors. He is a fellow of Informs. So now, without further ado, I give you Dr. Mehrotra.
Zitang and Vinod, really appreciate you inviting me to give this talk. I was telling the two of you before, this is a homecoming. I was for a while leading the Chicago chapter, and the fact that you guys have taken this initiative to do the webinar series on COVID, but also more broadly, really driving the chapter activities is extremely pleasing to see. You know, there's a lot that our community can offer within the space, within the Chicagoland area, but more broadly, particularly in this time when we have a lot of sort of data pouring at us. And sometimes decisions can be made better. So with that, let me just kind of give you a big picture perspective of what we'll be talking about. My talk structured with about 45 minutes of presentation, then we'll probably have 10 minutes of Q&A. So hopefully I will finish in time. There's several components to what I'll be wanting to talk about. So there is an aspect of supply chain and decisions in supply chain that need to happen over time. There's a component of sharing. And both of those, apparently historically, when you look at the models in supply chain and resource sharing, really have been not looked at the way it came about when this problem about ventilator allocation arose. So I want to give you also a perspective on how the work started, and then also see what the, you know, if you like, now in 3 months in hindsight, where could have been gone and how we could have, how we can be applying it in the future, okay? So I'll do some kind of a timeline for us. The work started on March 18th, 17th. This was a few days after Chicagoland area in the, you know, Governor of Illinois had announced lockdown. Okay. If you go back in time, those are the days when daily news briefings were happening by the president's team. And also the daily news briefings had begun to happen by some state governors. We were getting emails from within the dean's office. If you guys doing anything about COVID, let us know. I had no clue at the time what I'm doing about COVID, right? I mean, you're into your brain, you're doing your own research, anything to be done very quickly is a very, very sharp realignment of resources and how you would respond to a situation that's emerging. Okay. So back then, if you look at what data we had and how things would be looking into the future, we had very limited data. We basically were, in this case, I mean, the curve that you're seeing here is showing the number of cases that were reported at the time. And there was all sorts of possibility of where the demand for different things would be heading into the future. And of course, now 3 months into the future, we know that the new case reporting, at least of late, and this is a real graph coming from Wikipedia, has been pretty much linear over the days. So if you look at essentially the time duration between end of April to June, you can almost fit a straight line to the cumulative cases that are there in the country. Okay. The first draft paper based on the work was completed on April 2nd, in 2 weeks. Okay, at that time, if you look at this curve here, you would see that the growth in the demand was heading north. And not only was heading north, but it was exponentially heading north. So you could see that, I mean, this slide has the new cases that are reported per day, and you could see that the new cases reported per day were essentially growing linearly with a very sharp rate. Okay. If you look at this in time into the future here, we essentially now know that this rate of growth has stabilized and in fact have gone down a little bit. Well, just looking at the long term, of course, there are more recent anomalies where I think the trends may be trending back up again, but at the time, we were looking at this thing going north. Okay, this is of course, all in hindsight. The paper, this is the fastest paper I've ever written and gone through the referee process and have gotten accepted for publication. Okay, so the paper was accepted for publication in Naval Research Logistics within a week. So we had made our technical report available on April 2nd and got reviewed within a week. At least from the acceptance perspective. So a revision was uploaded based on whatever comments we got from the reviewers within that week. So from start to finish, everything is achieved in, I would say, less than 3 weeks. And it really had to be done that way for it to actually have any meaningful impact at the time. Because we knew that the demands could be heading significantly north. And as the demand could be heading north, if you were to make a meaningful impact in terms of how one can use OR to support decision making, it needed to be happening in a timely manner. Okay, so this graph shows the number of new deaths, and obviously, as you realize from the graph, fortunately, around that time, the new deaths in the country had stabilized and now have actually declined more or less on a day-to-day basis during the last 6 weeks. if you just put the trend line, it's a decreasing trend, and hopefully it stays there. Okay. So again, I want you to listen to whatever I'm going to be sharing with that perspective. Papers based on US data had just begun to emerge at the time, where we're beginning to find, this is mid-March, that about 80% of the COVID patients actually had mild condition, and about 5% would be requiring treatment into ICU. And of the 5% patients requiring treatment into an ICU, 75% of the patients would require mechanical ventilation. So for those of you who might be not knowing this, mechanical ventilation is where you put this the mechanical system that will force oxygen into patient's lungs and through the whole body so that they can stay alive. On their own, patients are not able to breathe. So one needs to keep them artificially ventilated to make sure that the body is well oxygenated so that the organs don't rapidly deteriorate, and hopefully the body is able to combat the condition to be able to recover. So mechanical ventilation is not a cure. It is more like a mechanism to prolong a person's life till the person's body is able to fight things back, or other treatments are able to treat the patient effectively. Okay. Now also, and this is to give you a sense, so remember we are looking at our timeline back in sort of March place. And then we have somewhere here, we're beginning to do our analysis. And somewhere here, we are beginning to look at the results. And very early April, we are putting out our paper. These are our timelines. And what I'm trying to illustrate through this figure is, this is based on real data that got used in one of the presidential briefings. It was slides in the presidential briefings. That were actually using this type of data. This is not our data, but essentially the particular version that I'm using, which fortunately for us became available 2 days before we were running the computations for our paper. And those computations were revised 2 days before with the refreshed data that became available through this organization, Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation from University of Washington, Seattle. So at that time, you're projecting into the future, and what you're seeing in this figure, and I think for now just focus on the two extremes, are how their models had projected the future need for the ventilators. Okay. And I'm just picking up this slide because they also had other projections like future caseload, future demand for a number of ICU beds. But because the talk's more focused on ventilators, it's just prudent to just look at that. And for the moment, just ignore the lines in the middle, because the lines or the curves in the middle are essentially some samples that we had generated for computing. But for now, when you are very early in this prediction cycle, you realize that looking into the future, the crystal ball is really opaque in terms of seeing what be happening to what might evolve. Okay, so we looked at the data in the previous 3 slides in hindsight, but this is looking at future. Okay, so around the same time, we were seeing news, or things are also beginning to emerge in the news media, and different states in the country were being kind of emerging as hotspots. Like New York was already up very early on the curve, but places like Michigan, Louisiana were talking about supplies running out in terms of treating patients. Okay, so this is all happening real time while we are doing our work. So if you look at statements, basically in governor conferences like Governor Cuomo news briefings saying that, look, states unfortunately have to compete with each other to obtain ventilators from the manufacturers for those actually who are in a position to supply them. One of his news briefings, Governor Cuomo from New York said they've just placed an order for some number of ventilators at $25,000 a piece. However, they weren't even expecting them delivered in time for when they were anticipating their demand peaks. So in the news briefing, so this is exactly how things started. This quoting from March 31st, but around March 18th and 19th timeframe, there were news briefings that were happening where, like, Governor Cuomo is complaining about being short supplied on ventilators and pressuring, if you like, the central administration to try to provide them more. Remember, there was a time when one of the naval ships was sent over for potentially treating COVID patients to the city. And then back-to-back news briefings were basically talking about numbers of ventilators being sent from the central warehouse, the stockpile at FEMA, to the state. And there were, if you like, contention between how many ventilators are to be sent to different states. Okay, so again, everything I'm going to be talking about is at the state level, not at the hospital system level, but everything is also applicable at that level. For example, on March 31st, in the news briefings was said that about 8,100 ventilators have been already allocated to different states by FEMA. Numbers are provided as to how many ventilators would go to different states based on this initial allocation that was decided by the central government. Okay. And all of this data is becoming available through the news briefings real time. Okay, so with that as a backdrop, and realizing that ventilators are a life-saving or potentially life-saving or intervention, and then also at least potentially making sure that the person's pain is reduced as the COVID condition is rapidly deteriorating for them. We wanted to see what can we do from our perspective to potentially help understand what be the shortfalls and or surpluses of this, and also be able to allocate and or reallocate whatever is available in a more effective manner in order to help save lives. Okay, so I'll just, the rest of the talk, I'll have three big chunks. Briefly, I'll describe overall contributions and what unique features this particular problem presented to us. And our limitations at the time, because we had to produce results on a very, very short timeline. We'll talk a bit about the mathematical model. This is an OR talk. I'll talk about some computations that we did. I'll talk about some insights and also talk about where we are in terms of potentially translating what we've done into maybe some practice. Okay. So as I said, we convened very early. This is maybe the time point when my first conversation happened with one of my previous PhD student, Frank Shao. At that time, I'd actually talked to one of my other postdocs. The postdoc, I wanted to check if we were able to actually present the results in a way that they may be digestible. Rather, and you could have written the paper, but the presentation also needed to really happen So what we done was within a few days, 2-3 days, we had a very early alpha version of the online tool that we ended up at least doing a very, very basic proof of concept that this could be actually shared. So talk to Masood about it, talk to then Hamed, and then Carolina, and see whether we are all willing to push in our night hours to get this thing done. So the group convened roughly that time, and we all kind of were on board, and the interactive tool with the website is launched and made available on April 6th together with the paper. So in broad strokes, we developed what we'll call a multi-period planning model for a centralized decision maker who could be making allocation and reallocation decisions for inventory that is constrained. And in this case, that happens to be ventilators. And the idea would be to make sure that these allocations and reallocations can happen to reduce shortage as much as possible, and in the context, translating it to saving lives. Okay, so the allocation or reallocation or redistribution was also emerging in the discussions at the time. So this is an op-ed from these people who were at I believe Yale, where basically the day when we had our second draft release and the website release, they happened to have this op-ed where they're talking about again national redistribution of supplies for saving lives. So it was kind of so coincidental that we were working on it, but other people, two of the folks here are from the clinicians. Diane is a MBA and MBA student and a clinician. So they wrote the op-ed that appeared in USA Today. Again, the idea is to again share equipment so that more lives can be saved. Statements made by in the news briefings where the two types of statements that were being made. One where Governor Cuomo, in this case, is announcing that they're going to get X number of ventilators from China and Oregon to ease off their situation. Again, remember, they were actually up a hill at the time, and they're expecting the peak happening somewhere around middle of April. Okay. Then again, a few days later, Governor Cuomo is saying that, look, I'd be more than happy to share my excess inventory. So this is, if you look at the time differences here, April 4th and April 19th is where the second statement is happening, where once he begins to realize that they've got things more under control, they've got excess inventory, they will be willing to send it over to Massachusetts. Okay, so that's part of the willingness to allocate and reallocate. Okay, so overall, if you step back, this problem had the following characteristics. We have different sources through which the demand could be met. Each of the state had its historical ventilator inventory through previous acquisitions and purchases by the hospitals, and within the state possibly their own state stockpile. Okay, we had FEMA, which has an initial inventory through its own stockpile. And then there's one other thing that's happening around the same time where, again, for those of you who are listening to those news briefings, the Defense Production Act was invoked to pretty much strongly suggest many of the major manufacturers, auto manufacturers particularly, to actually start producing ventilators, either directly themselves or in collaboration with companies that are previously producing ventilators, but speeding up the production for those ventilators. So there's that extra exogenous inventory that is coming into the system with some projected future dates. And statements about these projected future dates are being made in these news briefings. So I was actually listening to Peter Navarro a couple of days ago, and one of the success stories is claiming about whatever efforts being made by the central administration was that they managed to bring this ventilator situation very much under control. And at this point, they're talking about sending the ventilators over to places like Brazil and India. Okay. But from the perspective of the model itself, or the problem, we had at each time period, there's ability for FEMA and the states to decide whether they will take part of the inventory and want to share that with other entities, other states, or send them back to FEMA for use in the future. And why would that make sense? Like, why would it make sense for a place like New York? Was because we actually, let me go back. We actually had different peaks for demand for different states. So New York was expected to peak at around mid-March, whereas California is expected to peak around early May. So that 2-week differential essentially says that if I have managed to take care of my peak, I have the luxury to send some of the excess inventory over to a different state, which is now in need. Okay, so this is sort of the background. Now, with this in mind, let me just get a little bit into the technical framework. So if I was to do it perfectly, this problem is more like a sequential decision-making problem, where we have uncertainty. In this case, one of the biggest uncertainty is future demand. Remember, I showed you those demand curves. There's a huge difference from, if you like, the lowest curve to the highest curve that were generated by IHME. And again, fortunately for us, we had those things, at least the lower and the highest curves available for each one of the states generated from IHME. So the model actually has demand that is stochastic. We have this initial inventory. We have decision-making that is happening at each time period about allocation and reallocation. And then we have the state of the inventory at each one of these states, the amount of inventory in each of the states that would determine, whether they have excess, whether they have shortfall at that time point. Okay. And then as we roll the time clock forward, say by 1 day, we then have whatever is the inventory that is remaining. Okay. And there will be situations under which we may have shortage, or we will have situations under which we may have actually potential surplus. So again, if it's surplus, fantastic, right? Then the problem really goes away, at least from the perspective of life saving. But if there is shortage, you want to make sure that the overall shortage somehow is optimized or minimized. All right. So what we did was we simplified the problem. We said we're going to look at, in the interest of time, the model problem as a 2-stage problem where we'll have a here and now decision that'll help provide some guidance as to how the allocations can be made. And then there's a wait and see decision, which is each time, under each demand scenario that might actually emerge, FEMA would be making some reallocation decisions based on the demand scenario that would emerge. And this whole framework is basically within the framework of a 2-stage stochastic integer program with recode. So that's a classical modeling approach to model problems where decisions to be made under uncertainty. And fortunately, I have quite a bit of work in that space, so it was very natural for me to think in that direction. And the overall goal will be to ensure that we want to minimize the expected shortage of inventory. Okay, so with that in mind, a bit of a math here. We have a number of states, different states in the country. We have planning period over which we were to look at future demand. We have the demand forecasts available to us as forecast scenarios emerging, where demand is emerging over time. And then we have
I think Dr. Mehrotra lost his connection.
yeah, could you would you mind would you mind forwarding the slides, Zitan?
Yeah.
You were able
I'll
to hear me. For
put
some
up the
whatever
slide.
reasons, I lost the connection for the slides.
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Just hold on a moment.
we are slide 17, and I knew this was going to happen.
17.
That's why I had the backup plan.
I'll do that.
My apologies.
Just 1 second. Share my screen.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think you can go ahead.
Yeah, let me go ahead with that. That's perfectly
Yeah.
fine. So we have number of states, we have planning periods, we have demand that's stochastic, and then we have the initial inventory that is available at each state. We have initial inventory at FEMA. We have a production function Q, which suggests a number of ventilators becoming available over time. Next slide, please. Now we have parameters in the models, and the three important parameters to keep in mind. This is around which we're going to do some sensitivity. So one is the fraction of ventilators that are available, or fraction of inventory that's available for the inventory that's available at each state that can be really used for COVID patients. So this is essentially 1 minus what will be needed for non-COVID patients. So remember, historically, the ventilators are there for a variety of different reasons in the hospitals. There is another parameter, which is basically of the inventory that is available, that belongs to a state, what fraction of that inventory they will be willing to share with other states. So this is the inventory that is really within the state and within the hospital system. We really have no idea at the time as we're running the models as to what that might be. And the third one, which is also important in this case, is that there's a risk aversion between states. So they may get inventory, and this was a big dialogue that was happening in news briefings where, and why FEMA wouldn't just give every ventilator over to New York would be that, the state might want to hold on to the ventilators because they may think that there may be an explosion of demand into the future. Okay, so we, in the model, built in a risk aversion parameter that would ensure that if they have an inventory only after the projected demand is a certain multiplier of the current demand that they're going to be willing to share. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, from the decision perspective, there's a here and now decision, which is that we're to share the number of ventilators that will be allocated to each state in the here and now framework, whereas in the future, there's going to be readjustment of this inventory. So the number of ventilators that, and FEMA being a central coordinator, they'll be sent to FEMA by a state if they have excess inventory, and then the inventory they'll be sent back from FEMA over to the specific state under a different demand scenario that's emerging. And finally, the inventory that would be at FEMA at any given time in the future. Next slide, please. So the overall framework is that we're basically doing some kind of a weighted sum minimization here when we look in making sure that we are minimizing the expected cost of the future, where the future is uncertain. And then we have some costs associated with reallocation or allocation of these ventilators initially. So we don't necessarily want to give it out if we don't think that there's a value to it. And that cost is like a small penalty parameter theta that's put into the model. I think we just use 0.1 for that throughout. Next slide, please. So the overall problem, this is the second stage, the future decision had three aspects to it. One is the inventory balancing that is happening within the state. Inventory balancing that is happening, this is the first set of required constraints. The inventory balancing that will be happening at FEMA. And remember, we have this exogenous inventory that's becoming available. So that balancing incorporates that exogenous inventory. We also have a restriction that says that when I look at the sum total over all the states, that sum total will ensure that the whatever is being given remains valid in terms of available inventory. And then the fourth constraint was the most interesting one in this whole setup, which is about sharing risk aversion. So the first part of it, and it's explained in the next slide as well, was essentially looking at whatever is that excess inventory a state will be willing to share from its initial stockpile, and then having the risk aversion parameter ensure that it'll only be willing to share this amount Z and T if this overall risk adjusted shared function will take a value larger, is significantly large. Okay? Below that, it wouldn't be willing to share. And there could be many other ways of modeling this, but at that time when we were doing it, this just made the most sense and the quickest way for us to actually generate results. And the rest of the constraints are based on what a state is willing to share and so forth. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, this slide is explaining what I just said in words before, making sure that the amount that is available for sharing satisfies this risk aversion requirement and the shareable inventory requirement. Next slide, please. Okay, now that problem, if you look at it from an optimization modeling perspective, is actually a non-convex. The constraint the sharing constraint is a non-convex constraint, but fortunately we can actually linearize it with a technique known as Big M. Many of you might know that already. So in this case, again, we went straight to just making things as simple as possible for us to proceed rather than trying to analyze the structure mathematically. So we could take that non-convex framework and rewrite it as a bunch of linear inequalities, assuming that we have this constant M available to us that'll ensure validity of that constraint. And remember, the objective here was a hinge loss function. We only penalize if we have a shortfall in the objective. And that can be easily modeled with just two linear inequalities. Next slide, please. So one of the comments in the review process that we got back was, can you incorporate lead time into your model? And that makes a lot of sense because it is possible that inventory that becomes available within a hospital may have to go through a couple cleansing steps before it can be sent back to FEMA for further sharing, or before it can be sent to any other state for sharing. So we adjusted the model, incorporating the lead time also as a parameter in the model. It changes the structure of the equations a little bit, but in terms of how the indexing would happen. So you see T minus L in this slide that sort of adjusts the structure, but you could pretty much say take the same older template without the without the lead time and adjust. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we had the modeling framework in place. Okay, we wanted to run the model within a realistic setting back then. The data that we had was available through this IHME website. Fortunately, I should say, otherwise we wouldn't have access to that state level data while we were doing the modeling. It just became available at 3 in the morning, I should say. This data, the way it was available to us was only values of the lower limit and the upper limit of the confidence interval that they generated. There was some technical explanation of it, but not enough for us to even know what they were doing under the hood to exactly generate those upper and lower limits. Nonetheless, we needed to proceed with our analysis. So what we ended up doing was we looked at their confidence interval, and from there we ended up sort of backtracking and generating demand scenario trajectories for future demand that we say start from starting date March 23rd all the way up to end of May for use in the model. Next slide, please. Okay. To make sure that we're doing some rigorous analysis, we generated 6 different ways to generate these future demand trajectories. So the first 2 were thinking the evolution of the future demand, what we'll call the 2 different ways of thinking about averaging. And we needed to look at it this way because it turned out that their confidence intervals weren't really generated in a way that were symmetric. Then we're thinking like what might happen in the above average case, significantly above average case, a severe case, and then the extreme case. And the idea is that in each one of these situations, we could be focusing on on these demands and trying to see what its implication is going to be on overall planning and its implications on shortfall. Next slide, please. So just to illustrate, this is state of New York, future demand trajectories that are sampled from the 2 confidence intervals in case 1. This is kind of the average case where some of the future demand trajectories are below, some of them are above, if you like, the median line. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yep. So this is now case 3, where there's more concentration on the top, there's potentially some concentration in the middle, and some concentration at the bottom. Next slide, please. Now the demand is getting more concentrated to the top, and then maybe some situations with the demand maybe in the bottom quartile. Next slide, please. And now this is a little bit more extreme case where almost all the demand is concentrated in the top quartile from within the confidence intervals. Next slide, please. Now this is most extreme case where we're just looking at the upper limit of the demand curves generated by HME. Next slide, please. Okay, now in addition to it, the data is becoming real time. So in the presidential briefings, it was said that this is, I guess, March 23rd briefing, that FEMA had an initial inventory of about 20,000 ventilators in its stockpile. They were projecting certain production rates, this baseline production rate being about 80 ventilators a day under normal conditions, but with this act in place, at least what was being said was that this production rate will go up to about 300 plus ventilators a day sometime middle of April. I'm not sure if that actually happened, but I know at some point they started producing these excess inventory through having many of the automakers producing ventilators. Okay. Again, different parameter settings for sharing risk aversion, fraction of inventory we needed for non-COVID patients, and shareable initial inventory. And then also parameter settings for different lead times, just to see what the implications might be. Next slide, please. Okay, within that 3-week time window, we set up, obviously implement the optimization model. We set up all computations on a parallel computer. Fortunately, I had access to it in my lab, 2 parallel computers, one 64 cores, one with 16 cores, to run these problems, just crank the numbers to be able to solve about 500 instances so that we can generate meaningful results. Okay, in solving them, we relaxed some integrality requirements and just made sense, but ensured that we were ensuring that sharing requirement. So there was only kind of discrete variable that was kept in the model. We then solved the problem in like a 2-step manner. We generated a heuristic solution first through what we'll call a deterministic formulation based on expected value of future demand, fed that solution as a warm start to try getting as best a solution as we could for this 2-stage model. Had a time limit of 3 hours on the 64-core machine, which had slower cores, whereas 2 hours on the 16-core machines that had more faster cores. Next slide, please. Okay, so high-level insights. What we realized from computations, as much as people were really nervous about it, was that if the demand scenarios would be matching up towards like the average case or middle of the average, slightly above average case, where we knew that about say 50 to 60% of the initial inventory would be used for non-COVID patients. And these numbers are realistic because eventually what we have realized is that in the emergency department, the admission rates dropped by about 50% for non-COVID patients. So right now, many of the emergency departments are running at 50% of their capacity, just because people weren't just coming to EDs anymore. So in those cases, we would find that the initial inventory that FEMA is claiming would be nearly sufficient. And fortunately, that turned out to be the case. Okay. However, at that time, the findings were that we could be short by about 12,000 ventilators if things are getting slightly worse. And that number would be getting even worse and worse as we go in the direction of more extreme demand scenarios. Okay. Another finding, and this is a high-level finding insight, was that this whole idea about sharing made a lot of sense even under extreme demand scenarios, where even if you could have given more ventilators to New York in the beginning, as the demand peak would subside, a whole lot of them under different, again, demand scenarios could be given to other states, anywhere from 400 to 17,000 of those which are allocated to the state in the beginning over a period of time. Next slide, please. So, okay, this is very, very small font, but all it's saying is that the first 3, and I've summarized it before, first 3 scenarios turn out, which fortunately turned out to be the case, we will be okay. Nothing to panic. It was really the extreme where there was going to be a big panic button. In this case, that panic would have to be hit even by April 15th or so, where places like Alabama and Illinois, they're all beginning to show up as having significant shortfalls. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another slice at the same situation. What it's trying to say is that the things would get worse if a state's sharing risk aversion increases. So, and they get worse and worse under different demand scenarios. So, the worst state at which state could be hit, in this case, Alabama, again, will be more like whosoever is getting, they're not willing to give back. And the idea is that if you are actually willing to give back, that helps other states. By the way, the second column here is essentially saying how many days of shortage could have happened if we were looking at the total ventilator shortage days. This is kind of the objective function in the model. Next slide, please. So as the work was happening, I wanted to make sure that it was going to be available for use. So as I said before, the proof concept of this tool was done within the first few days of modeling back in March. But by the time we actually released the first draft of our paper, we also had a live interactive tool, which is still available. You can go on site and check it out, which now in sort of all retrospective, where you could actually play with different dates and see what shortfalls would be under different parameter settings for this tool. So as you could see, I think I've kind of got the GIF from the site for a date somewhere in the middle of April, early April, and you begin to realize that there's going to be a significant shortfall in places like New York and Louisiana under that particular parameter settings that were there for the model. And the way we could run this model interactively was, you remember I said that we solved these 500 or so optimization models. All of those were solved. The results from those models were pre-populated in a backend database, and the site is basically being driven through that backend database. And again, I was very fortunate at the time that one of my postdocs, Masood, had all the necessary tools, trainings. I mean, love to recommend him for a job when he's ready with all the different skills that he has. But we pulled it off like in just about 2 weeks' time to actually have this very nice, active, live website that one can interact with and view the results. Next slide, please. So again, last slide here, more or less, takeaway. So we know that there have been changes. Obviously, if I go back to my very first slide, back in the middle of March, lockdowns are being announced. Okay, whether those lockdowns are helpful or not could be very, one can debate. But from our perspective, I could say that those lockdowns that were announced have really helped avert a major healthcare disaster. Because if the demand had gone up at the exponential rate at which it was going up back during the last week of March, for another week, and I think this is like a week, if the decisions were made 1 week late in New York, they would have been really scrambling for ventilators and beds and all the associated inventory to take care of patients. Okay. The other takeaway is that in a resource-constrained environment where the demand can actually have different peak times, sharing can be beneficial. Okay, it's like community coming together to help each other, because what I need today, I will not need in a week from today, so might as well just help. I get more today, but I'm willing to give back what I've got. I'm not hoarding. And there were concerns about hoarding at the time. Okay, now the more risk aversion, obviously, in terms of sharing, then it has implications on efficiency. And then again, I would say models like this over a period of time could be used as planning models where one can actually have a central agency that can help facilitate coordination in countries like US. And now at this stage, maybe across different countries, which are now beginning to peak. Like I know India is doing, peaking now and probably continue to have its increasing rate. Many of the other developing countries are in that situation. So potentially, now that we know that we have stabilized things in US, potentially some of that inventory can go to other countries for help saving lives of patients in these countries. Next slide, please. Okay, so where we are heading, so we had some conversations with one of the early stage startup companies who's actually in the space. Fortunately, they were doing these things even before, They're talking to American Hospital Association. They're talking to FEMA at the time. We just got connected. So some conversations are happening to see if this can be operationalized at the national level within the hospital systems. So they've gotten a bunch of hospital systems that have pledged the inventory to them. So we'll see how that dynamics evolves over the next few weeks. Some of the discussions happened as late as last Friday. From a technical perspective, I think what we put together is just a baseline model that had to be very quickly completed. Many different possibilities to extend it, to analyze it, to do more things with it. From a specific application perspective, there are different types of ventilators. From decision-making perspective, one can be thinking in terms of risk aversion, in terms of min-max type of frameworks, looking at multiple objectives, looking at additional logistical requirements, maybe creating warehouses or local depots that can facilitate redistribution. We didn't have the time to do any of that. All are valid possibilities. And I already mentioned that the models adaptable, or models of this type are adaptable for situations where you have to be looking at disasters that are happening simultaneously, hitting different countries at the same at around the same time period, but not exactly at the same time, right? And then I would say the last of this is when we're making decisions under uncertainty, I should say that forecasts really matter, right? As you could see, when we had data that was emerging very early stage, it really was a wild west in terms of what people could be forecasting. I mean, this federal administration is using IHME forecasts because they sounded most reasonable and somewhat more, they were predicting less deaths in the country compared to, let's say, model coming out of UK that was predicting 2 million deaths. Model coming out of Colombia that's predicting 500,000 deaths. So numbers are all over the place at the time. And they're all being used for forecasting. And in this case, I mean, with that kind of a variability, we obviously, you know, it's the scenario analysis of what if different things might emerge and what would be the worst case that can happen really also matters. I would say one other thing I should kind of say in capping is that some of the production functions, if I was to look at it in hindsight and looking at the same data, I probably would have pushed forward some of those, the Defense Act activation time. I mean, you know, I think a week there could be making a very significant difference. So that happened by end of March. We've done some analysis by pushing those dates forward, and you could clearly see that it would be happening, you know, almost kind of looking at the worst case that switches from one scenario to another scenario because the stockpile would become available more early, or the productions will become more available more early. And I have to say that, I mean, it's all in hindsight, but sometimes when we're thinking that we have this emergency evolving, putting it, you know, like nipping it in the bud and trying to activate all things that we can be activating early on, maybe the best risk-averse strategy when one can actually embark upon. So with that, I'll stop and I'll take any questions that may be there. Maybe next slide is just thank you notes and stuff. The paper is available online for those of you who care to read.
I think we may have time for one or two questions. As I'm reading from the chat box, the first question I received is that, did you ever consider using epidemic models such as SEIR, compartmental models, etc., to predict demand?
So we are not doing forecasting ourselves at all. We used IHME data for forecasting, and the models that they built didn't have the SEIR elements in them, but turned out to be, and I've looked back, turned out to be credible. At the time, we know that people were developing SEIR type models, even folks at Northwestern, but unfortunately, all of that effort was just happening locally. There was no central effort other than what came out of UK and out of Colombia that was done where data would become available from these forecast models at the state level. So there was effort that was happening, I know, at Northwestern for state of Illinois. There was, I believe, effort that was happening in Massachusetts.
I think we lost his voice. Let's wait a second if the speaker can rejoin the webinar.
Hey, this is Vinod. While we're waiting, I just want to throw it out there. Our chapter is organizing one more such talk, again in the COVID webinar series. We also have a career fair coming up for all those who are attending, right? So we really value your participation. We value your ideas. Please send your suggestions to us. You can connect with us through the Informs Connect website, and I hope like most of you are like chapter members. So Zeting is posted the link in the chat, and all this came about from like our I think like a month or so ago, we'd sent out a survey to the chapter asking the chapter, hey, what all kind of events you want to see? Top of the list, of course, was like COVID analytics and also like career development. So if you have other such ideas, items you want to see, we are here for you. So please go visit the Informs website, drop us a note. We will share our contact information. You probably already have Zetang's. And just wanted to like throw it out there.
All right, with that, we are a little bit over time. Before we have to close the webinar, I know I'm not sure if Dr. Mehrotra is back online or not, but let's give him another virtual round of applause and thanks. And lastly, as Vino said, we are organizing another webinar next Friday on the 2016th at 11 a.m. Central Time. You can find the link in the chat box. We will have Dr. Sheldon Jacobson joining us next Friday. I'll see you then. And thank you all for attending this webinar. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.